I'm truly honored to be here, and this is a thrill to talk to people who are actually doing this work as opposed to talking mainly to academics. So I'm really eager to kind of have a conversation here and to get some honest feedback about what you think about this argument. What I'm going to try to do is to talk about the book and kind of bring out what I think are some of the key kind of empirical observations of the book, and then link it back to what we're doing here, link it back to this context and this conference and what Purpose Built is doing. So let me start with the book, and I'll breeze through this a little bit quickly, and you know, I won't explain the graphs in too much detail, but we'll try to give the main points. And so what I want to start with is the subtitle, which is The End of Progress Toward Racial Equality. Okay, so this is a depressing subtitle, but it is an empirical reality. So, you know, one thing I make clear is that there was actually tremendous progress toward racial equality in the 1960s. This was a period of major advances in civil rights. This was a decade where there was a major expansion of the black middle class. But then what people don't notice or kind of think about it is how that progress ended. Okay, so this graph shows trends in family income from 1970, I believe. Sorry, the font is even too small for me here. From 1970, I think, through 2012 or so. And so the line on top is showing the trajectory for white families in the U.S., and the line on bottom for African-American families. So there's been no change since 1970. Okay, the racial gap in family income has remained the same. And this is kind of just an empirical fact that is not acknowledged frequently. We think of kind of progression toward racial equality as linear, as steady. That's not true. There was a lot of progress, and then it stopped. Okay, it's not only that racial gaps in family income have stayed the same. It's that African-American families that were children from African-American families who were in the middle class a generation ago have experienced extremely high rates of downward economic mobility relative to their parents. So on your right here, the columns on the right show the proportion of black children and white children who were raised outside of poverty a generation ago, and the proportion who have moved downward in the income distribution relative to their parents. So this is telling us that more than half of African-American children who were raised in the middle class, okay, who were raised outside of poverty, have moved downward in the income distribution relative to their parents. This figure tells us the same story, but we'll pass over that and think about what happened here. Think about what the implications are. So how do we understand these patterns? How do we understand the empirical fact that children who grew up during the civil rights era, African-American children who grew up with more civil rights than any previous generation, more access to opportunity, at least in theory, have experienced virtually no gains in economic status relative to whites and have experienced extremely high rates of downward mobility. When academics take on this question, or at least most of the research literature, when it takes on this question, we focus on characteristics of individuals or families. We focus on things like human capital formation, culture, family structure, intelligence. These are kind of the explanations that the research literature gravitates toward, okay? What I'm arguing in the book is that we have to move outside of the home. We have to think about, in order to understand racial inequality, the persistence of racial and ethnic inequality in the United States, we have to consider the environments in which black and white children are raised and how those environments have changed or not changed over the past 40 years. That's kind of the overarching argument of the book. And what we find when we do that is that black and white children continue to be raised in entirely different social worlds. Okay, so these figures on the left show the average neighborhood environments from birth to 17 for black children on the left, and then next to them for white children. And I'll translate this graph for you. What it shows is that for an earlier birth cohort, this is kids born from 1955 to 1970, 62% of African American kids born over this period were raised in neighborhoods with at least 20% poverty, compared with 4% of white children. Okay? Now if we fast forward 30 years later and we look at a cohort born from 1985 to 2000, those are the columns on your right. Okay? Nothing's changed here. 66% of African American kids spend their childhoods in neighborhoods with at least 20% poverty, compared to, let's say, 6% of white kids now. Black and white children continue to be raised in entirely different social worlds. This is not explained by income, okay? I won't go through this graph in any detail, except to say that I'm breaking down, we have black families in the U.S., Hispanic families, and white families, and they're grouped into families making less than $30,000, 30 to 50, 50 to 99, and at least $100,000 per year, okay? So this is looking within income groups, okay? And I'm comparing families based on this measure of what we call concentrated disadvantage, which is not just neighborhood poverty, but joblessness, family structure, welfare receipt, okay? All of these move together. So this is like a scale of neighborhood disadvantage, where if you're higher, it's worse, okay? So we see within each income group, there's this gradient where black families live in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, followed by Hispanic families, followed by white families. But the real comparison, what surprised me and what surprises people even people who know this stuff, who study this stuff, is this comparison. Okay? This is the figure for African American families making at least $100,000 or more. This is the figure for white families making $30,000 or less. Okay? What this tells us is that African American families making $100,000 or more live in more disadvantaged environments on average than white families making $30,000 or less. Okay, so when we think about racial inequality and ethnic inequality in neighborhood environments, this is not a story about group differences in income or wealth. This is a story about the very unique interaction between race and neighborhood inequality in the United States. Now, this argument is not entirely new. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. You all know this stuff. If we go back 30 years, William Julius Wilson wrote this book that probably many of us have read, called The Truly Disadvantaged, where he kind of observed what had happened in central cities and documented the changes in urban labor markets and the outmigration of middle-class families and how this had led to a new type of concentrated poverty in central cities. And this was kind of just a seminal work in sociology, but also in our understanding of poverty and how it now looks in cities. Doug Massey and Nancy Denton then wrote, 7 or 8 years later, wrote another classic book called American Apartheid, where they argued that everything that Wilson had observed and everything that he argued was possible because of the persistence of racial segregation. Okay, so see, these are some of the classic studies of urban poverty. What I'm arguing in this book is that it's not only that poverty has become more concentrated over time, it's not only that racial segregation has persisted, it's that the same families have experienced life in the most disadvantaged environments, not over a few years, not in a single generation, but over multiple generations. Okay, that's kind of the fundamental empirical finding of the book, and it drives everything else. This figure just shows the proportion of black and white families, all of whom are followed over 2 generations, and it looks at the proportion of families who live in poor neighborhoods. This is the poorest quarter of American neighborhoods in consecutive generations. And for black families, about half of African American families in the United States have lived in the poorest American neighborhoods over consecutive generations. So this is the median experience for African American families. This is true for about 7% of white families. If we take a different approach, and this is kind of the most common approach that we take, people in this room and academics, when we look at neighborhood poverty, we look at the environments in which kids live right now, okay? Well, if we take kids who are currently living in poor neighborhoods and look at what the environments of their families over long periods of time, what we see is that about 4 out of 5 African American kids who are currently in poor neighborhoods have lived in similarly poor neighborhoods, or are from families who have lived in similarly poor neighborhoods for at least 2 generations. Okay, so I'm arguing that this should change our perspective. This should change the way that we think about neighborhood poverty and neighborhood disadvantage, and make us think about it as something, not that exists at a given point in time, but something that is experienced over long periods of time and over multiple generations of families. Okay, so when we take this perspective, and this I think is the most, I'm really glad they passed out the books. I think my book sales doubled in the past week. I get about a nickel for each of those books, so I'm not going to get rich, but I'm still glad to see what the books out there. But if you want to skip the book and kind of focus on one key finding, this is it, okay? Because I think this should really change the way that we think about neighborhood inequality, and so that we can no longer think about it as something that's experienced at a given point in time. We have to think about it as something that extends across time. We have to think about current neighborhood poverty as a continuation of disadvantage that's been experienced by families over long periods of time. Okay, so let me provide some evidence. Let me skip the theory and provide some evidence here, because I think what this does is it makes us think about the consequences of neighborhood poverty differently. Okay, instead of just focusing on where kids live, we have to focus on the cumulative, cross-generational. How did you put it, David? I did like the phrase you used. Intergenerational place-based deficits. Fortunately, the book's already published, but that's good. I like that. Second edition, exactly. And so when we take this perspective, let's go back to those findings about economic mobility, okay? What I find is that if you consider where the parent grew up, so not just where a kid grows up, but where the parent grew up, then you can explain about half of that deficit in the probability of moving downward in the income distribution. So the effects of growing up in a disadvantaged environment don't disappear when a child grows up and begins to raise his or her own family. They extend on to affect the next generation through a whole set of pathways. Through pathways of the school, through pathways of access to economic opportunities, through pathways of mental health, through pathways of exposure to environmental toxins. So all of these pathways accumulate and go on to affect the next generation. This is why there are cross-generational effects of neighborhood disadvantage. The second piece of evidence, and then I'll move on to the policy, the second piece of evidence that I just want to focus on looks at development of cognitive skills. And this is, there's so much focus on academic achievement gaps and racial achievement gaps. Well, the evidence linking neighborhood disadvantage with the development of cognitive skills, and this is stuff we measure when we look at racial achievement gaps, is so incredibly strong and goes such a long way toward explaining why these gaps are so persistent. So what this graph shows, on the far left, this shows the average score on a standard assessment of reading and language skills. That goes into these scales of cognitive skills, or IQ. They're sometimes just called IQ, but they're assessments of cognitive skills. This column on the far left shows the average scores for kids from families that have never lived in poor neighborhoods. Okay, this second column shows the average scores for kids whose parents were raised in poor neighborhoods, but the child was not. This one shows the average score for kids who were raised in poor neighborhoods when the parent was not. And then this shows the average score for kids from families that have lived in poor neighborhoods over consecutive generations. And this is after an extremely conservative and rigorous adjustment for everything else that is observable about these kids and their families over time. So this is the causal effect of neighborhood disadvantage over multiple generations. And what this tells us is that it is cumulative, okay? This is a finding that David referenced. The difference, the effect of living in disadvantaged neighborhood environments for multiple generations is to reduce kids' development of cognitive skills by around 2/3 of a standard deviation, 9 or 10 points. That's the equivalent to missing 2 to 4 years of schooling, okay? So just this enormous impact that exists not because kids live in a disadvantaged environment at a given point in time, but because they are from families that have experienced neighborhood disadvantage and everything that goes with it, okay? Deficient schools, exposure to violence, exposure to environmental pollution, okay? Less access to economic opportunities. They've experienced these different dimensions of neighborhood disadvantage over long periods of time, over multiple generations. Okay, so what I argue in the book is that this multi-generational perspective first should really change how we study neighborhoods and how we think about the consequences of neighborhood disadvantage. But secondly, more relevant for this conference, I argue that it should change the way that we think about urban policy and about policy approaches to confronting neighborhood disadvantage. And I don't take a strong stand advocating for specific policies in the book. Instead, my goal at least was to argue for a set of principles that I refer to as durable urban policy. When I talk about durable urban policy, I'm talking about policy or programs or interventions with the capacity to disrupt multi-generational patterns of neighborhood inequality, generate transformative changes in places and in families' lives, and withstand fluctuations in the political mood and the business cycle. Okay, essentially what I'm doing is I'm looking back at the history of urban policy and seeing this cycle where exciting ideas and promising programs are implemented with great fanfare, and they're good ideas, you know, a lot of with passion behind them, but then over and over are diluted in the political process, abandoned, implemented without sufficient funds to make transformative changes, implemented for a short period of time, and then abandoned when an administration changes. This has happened over and over. This is a cycle that has repeated itself when we think about the history of urban policy. So I think instead of kind of focusing on good ideas, I argue that we should focus on principles for durable urban policy. And that's the starting point. Those are a set of principles. Now, how does this translate into actual policy interventions or programs? When we think about kind of the dominant approaches, or at least the possible approaches that we could use to address concentrated poverty and its consequences, I think of this along three categories. Okay, and the first is policy approaches that try to alter the distribution of where people live. Okay, and so the most common examples here are voucher programs or residential mobility programs, housing assistance programs. And again, I'm not arguing for or against this approach, but I am arguing that if we take this approach, then we have to start by thinking about what types of residential mobility approaches might be durable. That is, might allow families to make a transformative move and then to remain in their new communities and integrate into those new communities over time with support and resources that allow them to do that effectively. And that's where we failed with residential mobility approaches. The overwhelming pattern is for families to move and to reproduce patterns of neighborhood inequality as they navigate the private rental market on their own. So here are some examples of programs that have kind of recognized this deficiency, taken active steps to support families and provide the types of sustained support that allow families to make transformative moves that persist over time. Secondly, we can think about just doing housing policy differently, and I won't go into much detail here, but there are a bunch of things that we could do that would immediately reduce the level of neighborhood inequality. The problem here has always been political. Okay, when these programs are implemented, it is difficult to count on them being sustained across political administrations, and I think that's true with a lot of programs that are on the table now. The third approach is to think about interventions that permanently weaken neighborhood disadvantage and its consequences. And here I'm essentially thinking about place-based investments that take kids in disadvantaged environments and make sure that they are not impaired by those environments, that they have every opportunity to advance in the income distribution, to go to a quality school, that they live in safe neighborhoods, even if they're relatively high poverty neighborhoods, and that they have a chance to go to college and so forth. So to weaken the connection between growing up in a disadvantaged environment and its consequences for the life chances of kids. And I put a question mark here because we haven't done this well. Okay, so when you look at the history, particularly of federal programs designed to implement place-based investments, we have this cycle where programs are proposed, are implemented, and then are abandoned or diluted. So this is where I think purpose-built communities comes in, okay? And this is why when I heard about this organization, this is why the message and the vision behind it resonated with me, because I think of this as a durable place-based program. And what makes it durable is that first it starts with an institutional foundation and community buy-in. Okay, so this idea of the community quarterback, beyond anything that you all actually do, like, people have tried to fix housing and schools and health before. I'm not saying they're not good ideas, they're great ideas, but people have tried that stuff before. I think what is truly unique here is starting with the community quarterback idea and building, because from what I can tell, people know that institution is going to be there. People can count on that institution. Okay, so when I say that resting on a stable foundation is important, it's not necessarily the level of resources, but it is the community being able to count on those people being there for the long term, and on that institution being there for the long term, and planning change around that institution. I think that is missing from almost all interventions designed to create neighborhood change, and I think that is the vital piece of what Purpose-Built is doing that separates it from most of the place-based interventions that have been implemented over time. And then it meets other criteria of durable urban policy, meeting the needs of parents and their kids, thinking about holistic interventions that cross multiple generations. So this is why, the vision of Purpose-Built immediately resonated with me. This is why when David asked me to come here, I was really honored and thrilled about the chance to talk to all of you. Whenever I talk to people who actually do this work, I learn substantially more than when I present this to my colleagues, where we're still back on slide 3 talking about where that estimate came from. So I see this really as kind of a unique chance to get some feedback and to learn what I'm missing or what I'm getting right from all of you. So I'm very grateful for this chance to talk with you. I'm very grateful to David for inviting me. I'll stop there. Thanks.
So Patrick, obviously there's two sides to this coin that you've touched on, which is how do you change the nature of these disadvantaged neighborhoods, which is where really we're focused. And then there's how do you provide opportunities for low-income people to live in neighborhoods that are already healthy. And I know that, I'm sure you're familiar with Paul Jargowski's work at Rutgers, who has really been emphasizing that other side of the coin. How do you get policies in place to open up those neighborhoods for low-income people? And you touched on it, but I'd like to hear a little more, because one of the feedback that we get all the time is, yeah, you're doing this in this neighborhood, but you're really just spreading the problem out, that you're not solving anything, that you're just dispersing what do you want to define the problem, which I take exception to how they define it, but that's a lot of the public perceptions around that. So I'd like to get your sense of how would you respond to that kind of criticism, and what's your sense of of Jargowski's view that without that side of the coin, we're never going to really solve this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so like this list of potential policies are probably consistent with what Paul Jargowski would argue for. And, I think, I think he's right. I think that without kind of, without policy that is designed, so our policy right now is designed to create neighborhood inequality. That's what it's designed to do. zoning policy, our federal investments. I mean, we spend more on the home mortgage interest deduction than we do on any other housing policy, okay? And so that is a program that overwhelmingly goes to the wealthiest Americans in the wealthiest communities. This is how we spend our federal dollars on policy. So we're creating neighborhood inequality actively, consciously, explicitly through state and federal policy. So I think Paul is exactly right that unless that changes, these kind of broad, large-scale inequality that we see right now is probably not going to die away, okay, because we're actively regenerating it every day. That said, I think, programs that are designed to alter the immediate environments around families and programs that are designed to give families the option to make it in new neighborhoods and kind of sustain those moves, they improve people's lives. Like we have really good evidence of the transformative effects that a change in environment can induce. This notion that the problem is being spread around is simply false. Like there's really good, if you want to read another book, read Doug Massey's more recent book called Climbing Mount Laurel, where he talks about just what changed in this New Jersey suburb that experienced an influx of middle and low income residents in this new housing project. What he finds is that nothing changed. Okay? When families who want to escape poor neighborhoods move into different environments, they do not bring problems with them. Okay? We have really good evidence that changes are not negative and changes are not noticeable. So I think, beyond kind of the moral argument about what is acceptable in terms of neighborhood inequality and what types of environments we should be raising kids in, I think you can make the empirical argument and say, actually, we have really good evidence on this, and we can show that we can do this effectively without negative social consequences for neighborhoods that are absorbing families or for neighborhoods that are becoming more diverse. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but thanks for the question.
Good morning.
Morning.
I have a fourfold question, but I'm going to try to put it down to one. Number one is, during your research and gathering an hypothesis, are you looking at attitude or poverty, or those two things one and the same? And
I'm sorry, can you attitudes
versus poverty? Because all people who live in poverty, attitudes are not poor. And I'm also wondering, does not your data also drive policy? Not yours generically. And if so, what is the correlation between attitude and poverty? And if you were to replicate this study, your research, I'm just interested to know, would it be the same for a poor white neighborhood?
Yeah, great questions. And actually, before I answer that question, let me just say that, speaking in Texas, this might look a little bizarre that I've just presented white and black families throughout this presentation. So this is a function of the data that I'm using, a data set that started in 1968 and followed families since then. So they're just, in 1968, the country was not as ethnically diverse as it is right now, and there just was not a sufficient number of families from other ethnic groups to extend this to, for instance, Latino families. So that's the explanation. I should have offered that apology at the start. So attitudes and poverty. I think there are some cases where we can think about, and I assume you mean, I'm sorry, I lost it. I assume you mean attitudes of poor people, or do you mean attitudes toward poor people?
Poor people, and how do you quantify that data? Because primarily, once research has been done, the data is old anyway. So how do you really quantify that? When you make a presentation relative to an ethnic group, what is the balance in a poor neighborhood? The same attitude, say, in a white neighborhood as it is in a black neighborhood, and both neighborhoods are equally poor.
Yeah. Okay. So let me try to answer that, and I'll see how I do. And what I want to answer it by talking about the link between kind of attitudes and outlooks and what might be thought of as structural conditions, as the conditions of poverty. And what I'd say is that they're tightly linked for all groups in the sense that the reason I'm showing this graph is because this is a graph that just shows how far whether kids expect hope to graduate a four-year college and whether they expect to graduate from a four-year college. And I skipped through this just because I wanted to cut through the data a little bit. But what these graphs show is just the proportion of kids who say they do not expect to graduate college. This is they don't hope to graduate college. This is they don't expect to graduate college. Okay. Again, for kids, never in poor neighborhoods, parent in poor neighborhoods, child in a poor neighborhood, and both generations in a poor neighborhood, okay? So what this is telling us is that the best predictor of whether a child does not expect or hope to go and graduate a four-year college is whether that child's parent was raised in a poor neighborhood, okay? That's this column. That's a better predictor than whether the child, him or herself, is raised in a poor neighborhood. So when we talk about attitudes, I think of attitudes as a response, and here, you can kind of tell that I worked with William Julius Wilson because he kind of made this argument that our attitudes, our outlooks are important to study, but they are driven in large part by the circumstances in which we're raised, the circumstances in which we spend our lives. So these attitudes, and this is all groups. This is black and white kids all pulled together. I don't think that there's substantial variation in attitudes or culture that is unique to specific groups. I think it is driven largely by structural conditions in which different groups are raised. Okay, and that's what this graph is showing. Is that at least in terms of outlook, what a child expects for him or herself. We can understand this, at least we can go further in understanding this if we think about the environments in which not only that child was raised, but in which that child's parents or caregivers were raised a generation earlier. I'm not sure if that sufficiently answered your question, but point taken. Fair enough.
One of the challenges we find in inner city neighborhoods is how people, and the lady talked about attitudes, how people conclude why are people poor. And if you use that as your entry ramp to begin to discuss process, policies, and procedures, then you will discover, as many of us who have been working on this area, that the number one factor for people in poverty is institutional racism. And most of our systems refuse to address it at its root because it does deal with a substantial amount of emotion and the ramifications from a historical perspective of the damage it has caused within these neighborhoods of color. Now, while we can come in with incredible projects and programs and promises, as long as it's a top-down, outside-in solution, you're not going to receive the results that you want because there is no connectivity from the inside out. My second point is, those who are engaged in this work as you are, we have to be honest with ourselves. When we're writing our proposals or our programs, we see those individuals as disadvantaged, poor individuals. However, when we go to a grocery store and we see a poor black woman with 3 kids and a basket full of groceries, and she's using her government subsidy card, we don't see her as a poor, disadvantaged mom. Most have seen her as either a welfare queen or someone who is taking advantage of the system. So I look at it from a spiritual, a scientific, and a social perspective. So my point is, from a spiritual perspective, it says you can't keep pouring new wine in the old wineskins. And I think that's what we're doing as our community. We're just trying new programs and new approaches, but we're not getting to the root cause. As a person who grew up in abject poverty, and the only way I got out was because I could catch a football and I ran pretty fast. Couldn't read on a 12th grade level, couldn't write on an 8th grade level. But guess what? Because I could catch that football and because I ran real fast, they gave me extra tutors. They got me up in the morning, 3 square meals a day, gave me all the nurturing and support I needed to be successful on that football field. We need those same kind of attitudes when trying to address the issues of abject poverty, and how the institutions through the years have played a critical role in not looking at the pain of poverty, but the profit of poverty, because the war on poverty is a $1 trillion enterprise. So we have to rethink the institutional aspect, because if one fish bellies up, you look at the fish. But in many cases, 67% of the fish are bellying up on the inner city. It's time to start looking at the lake. And that's what I want to add to your presentation and like your perspective on that. Because until we deal with that, everything else is like new wine.
Thanks. I mean, on the first part of your point, I think, when we talk about urban policy, we invariably have this perspective on the present, on what neighborhoods look like right now, what types of environments kids live in at the current moment, and the way I hear your point is, if we think about processes of institutional racism, like, this is not long ago in our nation's history. This is actually a generation ago when opportunities were formally and legally blocked for Black Americans. And so the consequences of those policies and those practices, what I'm finding in this empirical work is that the consequences live with us today, in the sense that the disadvantages faced by a generation ago should not be expected to have disappeared by now, but rather persist on and affect the life chances of kids right now. So it's this multi-generational perspective on neighborhood poverty and neighborhood disadvantage that I think is fundamental to understanding the consequences of neighborhood poverty, and also to thinking about policy. We have to think about policy that addresses not just inequalities that exist right now, but that have existed, that have lingered on for the past 2 generations. And that's kind of the broad argument of the book. Now, the second question is where I defer to you about what should go on in a neighborhood to create that transformation. So I think, where I approach it is I approach it from kind of with a set of principles, that we need something that is going to be stable over time. We need resources that are, we can't have initiatives that push new money into a community that is gone 3 years later. That's not going to create transformative change. We can't have a mobility program that gives families the chance for an excursion out of poor neighborhoods and where they'll be back a few years later. So in that sense, I agree with your point that you can't just institute or implement the same ideas over and over in places that have experienced long-term disadvantage, long-term structural problems and challenges. But I think as to so I can kind of lay out some principles for what would allow for durable change, transformative change, and then I think communities have to dictate, within, from inside out, how that change is actually going to come about. Okay, And that involves community buy-in, but it also involves incorporating the voices of community members who have seen programs come and go over time, and kind of lending your voice to tell people who are coming in and implementing a program what has happened before, what is the history of that community, and what is possible for transformation.
I just had a question in terms of the policy changes. I was wondering if there was anything in your data set when you kept, for instance, longevity in poverty at a constant, the racial component constant. Was there a subset of that group that had, while still poor, less economic disadvantage than another subset of the same group? For instance, in each group, was there a group that was, yes, they were poor, yes, they were second generation, yes, they were black or white, but they had less disadvantage than others in the same group? Was there anything in that data set that was?
Are you referring to these graphs, or are you referring to?
Well, I'm just curious to see, in terms of what we can learn in terms of new policy. What your data has shown is that longevity makes a big difference,
right.
Race makes a big difference, and I'm just curious if you dug deeper into the data set to identify if there was in fact a group in there that lived in a different kind of neighborhood that, while still poor, while still second generation, while still white or black, had less disadvantage than others in the same group.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know that I've done the exact analysis you're asking for, but there are other pieces. Like, for instance, if chapter 6 of the book looks at families, kids growing up in poor neighborhoods, but where change is happening over the course of childhood. Okay, so they're in poor neighborhoods, but neighborhoods that become more diverse ethnically, but also economically over time. And interestingly, so I focus on African American kids growing up in the most disadvantaged environments, and what happens to those kids when their neighborhood changes around them. The types of changes that actually occurred in the poorest U.S. neighborhoods were not, it wasn't that neighborhoods became whiter. It was that neighborhoods became more diverse, and mainly became more diverse in terms of growing Hispanic populations. Okay, so that's been kind of the dominant mode of change that's happened in the poorest neighborhoods over the past 40 years or so. So it broadly fits your question in the sense that these are kids who are still living in poor neighborhoods, but there are hints of change and processes of change that are going on over the course of their childhoods that bring in new diversity ethnically and also economically, and new economic opportunities. And when those things happen, kids benefit enormously. Okay, so even if there are subtle amounts of change going on in a child's neighborhood, we see it in their later economic outcomes. We see that when new populations move into very distressed, poor neighborhoods, economic opportunities grow, and kids later in life make more money. They have greater earnings, are more likely to be employed. So there are at least hints of that even in very poor neighborhoods where we see signs of change, influxes of population, a little bit more diversity economically and ethnically, that the original kids in those neighborhoods benefit pretty substantially.
Hi, my name is Alice Simmons, and I'm from Oakland. So I want to begin by thanking you for a beautiful piece of work. And I think for those of us that are coming at the work as architects of change in an overall neighborhood, not so much programmatically, I think that it offers a real opportunity for us to begin to construct an argument, because quite frankly, this is a little bit preaching to the choir, right? I think most of us are going home and attempting to construct arguments that are about why we need a different level of investment given the disparity. And even your comment about every day we make federal decisions, allocation decisions, about supporting middle class sort of home ownership and wealth building. to the disadvantage of these neighborhoods is helpful frame. But I'd like to have you talk just for a moment about how you recommend we go home as architects for change in large neighborhoods and use data like this to construct arguments that help us attract the kind of resources cross-sector to our neighborhoods. So for instance, I'm here with my Housing Authority Director, Eric, who I love, and it's preaching to the choir for Eric, right? But Eric and I will have to go home and make some arguments about why we need other people to join us. And so what is your recommendation about how to, in the most compelling way, use this data in a local context to make arguments about how to change neighborhoods at scale?
Yeah, great question. So I think this question of thinking about durability is central. So whenever whatever policy we're talking about, we have to start with the question of how are we going to make sure that policy reaches not only children but also their parents, okay? And in that sense, we have to begin with the fact that when kids are raised in poor neighborhoods, their parents were too, okay? It's almost automatic. So when you're making a case for for housing policy, for instance, you have to start with the fact that kids are not living it's not episodic, particularly for kids who are racial or ethnic minorities. Living in a unstable housing situation and in a very poor neighborhood is something that is experienced continuously over time. So when we think about housing policy, we have to make sure that a family is in a house that it does not only provide a good environment at this point in time, but that it's stable over the course of that child's life, okay, over the course of childhood, okay? And the way the evidence fits in is you have to make the case that, for Black and Latino children in the U.S., it's overwhelmingly likely that they're not just in a poor neighborhood at a given point in time. They are from families that have experienced the same disadvantage over multiple generations. This is common, okay? This is something that is part of their families' histories, and that's not true. As this is one area where the racial difference is actually very real. That's not true for most white families. White families in poor neighborhoods are typically there for a short period of time and then move on, okay? So when we think about policy, I think the biggest argument to make is that the effects extend not only from where a child lives, but from where a parent lived a generation earlier. That means we have to address the needs of both children and parents and do it at the same time. That means when we implement policies, they have to be policies that we know are going to be sustained over time. We don't want to provide a family with a nice home for 3 years. We don't want to institute a program in a neighborhood that's an initiative that's going to run for 2 years. That might be a positive program, but if it's not going to be durable, if it's not going to be sustained over time, then it has no chance to create transformative change. Okay, so hopefully, the empirical argument kind of lends itself to the policy argument that we have to first think about durability, stability, and sustaining investments, and then think about what are the right investments.
Seminal work, I think, that will have a very significant impact, hopefully, on policy. I'm with the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities. Housing authorities are at the intersection of the tension between place-based strategies, mobility strategies, and sometimes inside the Beltway, it's always either or rather than both. Our federal housing programs serve about 5 million households, but we're only serving 1 in 4 that are eligible for the programs. And our metrics are very much focused on how we evaluate the effectiveness, or focused on process. Did you get the work order right? Did you, did your processes, do you have the 50 pieces of paper in the file? And so I'm very interested in your thoughts about how we shift our metrics in terms of evaluating these housing interventions, because you're really talking about the long-term durability of the impact, and none of the ways we think about our housing interventions are in sync with what your research is telling us.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah, I can be critical of our housing mobility programs for this reason, because I don't think there has been enough of a focus on allowing families to make sustained moves that really change and transform their environments. And we know how to do this. It's hard, but we know how to do this. So there are examples. The best example right now is the Baltimore Mobility Program. And they were forced to do this, okay? This was part of a consent decree. But what they've done is they have kind of taken families eligible for the program and sought out potential units in very different environments, in environments that are that have lower poverty, that are racially and ethnically diverse, and so they have offered explicitly these units to families as a starting point. They don't force anyone to go anywhere, but the default is to accept a unit in a very different place than the families from in Baltimore. So that kind of changing the architecture of choice, giving nudges so that the default is a very different environment. There's lots of evidence that that is a recipe for creating transformative change. And then what they do is they follow families. They work with families for 2 years after they have moved. And they do that to make sure that the family can integrate successfully into their new neighborhood. You know, the family may be moving to a neighborhood that lacks the same public transportation that they had in their origin neighborhood. So they provide services. I mean, Rolf Pendall at Urban Institute suggests that we should be supplying cars instead of providing bus passes, that this is kind of the key to allowing families to make sustained moves in new environments. But it's a long-term commitment to making sure that family is able to sustain their move to a new environment. And it is more difficult, but if you switch those metrics so that the metrics that you're evaluating performance by include, changes in neighborhood poverty, changes in racial segregation, exposure to racial segregation that persist over time, the proportion of families that move back into their origin neighborhood over time, if we could limit that proportion, then that would kind of shift incentives so that housing agencies and housing counselors are thinking about ways to keep families in new neighborhoods, ways to allow them to sustain moves in ways that are rare, because the focus is getting families into a new unit and making sure that unit is up to code, and that's it. So I think Stephanie DeLuca has done some great work here in this area, and I think the lessons there are clear. It's also, this is me, I don't work in a housing agency, so I know it's hard to do, it's hard to implement, but I think we have models about how to do it. Thanks.
My name is Daryl Armstrong from Trenton, New Jersey, and we saw your reference to Mount Laurel up there, and we continue to challenge the governor, who has tried to raid the New Jersey Affordable Housing Trust Fund and demolish the Coalition on Affordable Housing and really push the advancements that we've made in affordable housing back to the 70s when these decisions were first being made. So appreciate your research. My question is around the definition of family over time. And so your graphs speak to family income, family poverty. One would presume that there is an account, you're accounting for whether these are two-parent family structures to two-parent family structures, or as the data continues to suggest, that 70% of Black children are still born out of wedlock. Are we talking about blended family structures with one income, in making comparisons to white families that in 1968 was more likely to have two incomes, and that persists over time? So I'm wanting to drill down a little bit into the graphs of family structure, family income and disproportionality, and how do we account for these mixed family structures that have evolved over time, particularly because of socioeconomic status, right? Crack epidemic and all the other things that have continued to destroy Black families with two parents. How do we account for these conversations in your graphs?
Yeah, so in the data, family income is typically measured by, this is not the best answer, but people go through every member of the household who's identified as a family member. So it's separate from household income, which would be everyone who's living under the same roof and measure income sources from everyone. But I think your broader point is right that, in all of this, we have to think about family structure. That's hugely important. You can make the case that there are still enormous gaps by race and ethnicity in family structure, but you can also make the case that the dominant family structure in the United States has just transformed over time. So when Patrick Moynihan wrote the Moynihan Report back in 1965, which was this hugely controversial document that's continues to be controversial. He was writing at a time when the rate of out-of-wedlock births for African Americans was about what it is now for white families. Okay, so the point being, he was writing about a crisis in the black family in 1965. Well, if that was a crisis, that crisis has reached the entire U.S. population by now. So I think it's a fundamental issue that we have to deal with. It has a lot to do with poverty, and I certainly don't mean to dismiss it in focusing on neighborhood inequality, but I do think there's been less focus on stuff going on outside the home, whereas there's a tremendous amount of focus on what's going on within the home environment. Okay, thanks. I got to wrap up. Thank you.